This is a visual tour of the Voyage of the Beagle, the sailing voyage around the world that Charles Darwin took that had the major impact on him developing the theories of evolution. Our voyage begins in England, Plymouth, England. The HMS Beagle was a 10-gun brig under the command of Captain Robert Fitzroy of the Royal Navy. He sailed from Plymouth, England, on the 27th of December 1831. His mission was to complete a survey of Patagonia and Tierra del Fuego, the South American coastline. Charles Darwin accompanied him. Darwin was 22 years old and accompanied Fitzroy, who was 26 years old at the time, as his gentleman companion. Captain Fitzroy was well aware of the stressfulness and loneliness of leadership on sailing ships at the time. And of course, the captain was unable to fraternize with the crew in order to maintain discipline on ship. So he wanted someone to discuss scientific ideas, that would make good use of the ship's resources, and that would share meals, because the voyage was intended to last 2 years. It actually ended up lasting almost 5 years, the ship returning to England on the 2nd of October 1836. So the voyage began from Plymouth, England, and sailing along the European coast and the coast of North Africa to the Canary Islands. Within 3 weeks, the ship had arrived at the Cape Verde Islands off the west coast of Africa. From there, the ship began crossing the Atlantic. Making a brief stop at the St. Peter and St. Paul archipelago of islands, a very tiny set of islands in the mid-Atlantic. Continuing on to Fernando de Noronha, another set of islands off the coast of Brazil. And by February, arriving in Salvador, Brazil. At nearly every stop, Darwin explored the land. In fact, he spent more time on land than at sea during the voyage. He often got seasick, and so was grateful to get off, and every time the ship would land, it would restock, and while it was stocking and then surveying the local area, Darwin would explore, often going miles inland. I can't imagine how he would have felt in the area when they first landed in Brazil. Imagine this Englishman first experiencing the rainforest in Brazil. It must have been impressive. And at most stops, Darwin collected many specimens. Insects, he made an extensive insect collection, plants, rocks, fossils. After Salvador, the next stop was Abrajos, then Rio de Janeiro, and on to Montevideo, Argentina. The main survey mission was in Patagonia of South America, so Argentina. Darwin spent quite a bit of time inland there. Moving on to Bahia Blanco, it was a treasure trove of fossils in that area, and he collected many and had these fossils and most of his specimens shipped back to England on other sailing ships that were heading back that way before he arrived in England. So by the time he arrived in England, most of his specimens had already arrived. Continuing on to Port Desire, he noticed similarities of South American animals such as llamas and rheas to African and Middle Eastern animals such as camels and ostriches, and noticed that similar types of animals seem to live in similar climates. Finally, sailing to the tip of South America, Tierra del Fuego, Captain Fitzroy left 4 natives who had been taken to England from a previous voyage to establish a mission, a Christian mission. After Tierra del Fuego, they rounded the tip of South America and arrived at Cape Horn, then sailed out to the Falkland Islands. By the time they returned to Tierra del Fuego, only one of the 4 natives was still there, and he had returned to his native ways and declined returning to England. After Tierra del Fuego, they sailed back up the Argentine coast to the Rio Negro and up the river to explore that area. Then back to Gregory Bay and Rio Santa Cruz, with Darwin noting how desolate the landscape was. Finishing at Santa Cruz, they sailed around Cape Horn up the west side of South America along Chile, arriving at Valparaiso, then sailing back down to Chiloé Island, then heading north again to Valdivia. And while at Valdivia, they experienced a massive earthquake. He saw also the effects of the earthquake in Concepcion and documented that in his book about the voyage of the Beagle. Leaving Concepcion, they sailed north, arriving at Iquique, then Lima, Peru, and finally made the trip to the Galapagos Islands off the coast of Ecuador, the most famous stop of his voyage. Now, the Galapagos Islands are not tropical. They're more desert islands. Imagine desert plopped down in the middle of the ocean. There's several islands, some very small, some large, volcanic in origin, and generally barren. There's some good vegetation on some of the larger islands, some extinct volcanoes, and Darwin noted a lot of the unique biology that later helped him in developing his theories of evolution, but wasn't appreciative of it at the time. He noted strange animals like the marine iguanas, the tortoises, and the finches, but even at the time didn't recognize that all the finches he saw were actually finches. He thought they may be other species. He even failed to note which islands some of the finches came from. It wasn't until returning to England and learning from ornithologists that examined his specimens that they were all finches. And then he had to sort out what islands they came from. So the Galapagos weren't initially an area that he really appreciated at the time. After the Galapagos came the long trek across the Pacific to his favorite stop, Tahiti. And Tahiti is a beautiful tropical set of islands. To contrast to the Galapagos, beautiful lagoons, beautiful beaches, lots of vegetation, beautiful mountains, and Darwin was very impressed with Tahiti. The next stop came in New Zealand, followed by Sydney, Australia. After Sydney, the ship went to Hobart in Tasmania, the little island off the south coast of Australia. Then south around Australia to the Cocos Islands in the Indian Ocean, followed by Mauritius, a small island in the Indian Ocean approaching Madagascar. Next, the ship sailed around the southern coast of Africa, arriving in Cape Town, South Africa. Then heading back across the Atlantic, stopping briefly at St. Helena Island, a very tiny island in the south mid-Atlantic. Then, wanting to double check some latitude and longitudes, Captain Fitzroy sailed the ship back to the coast of Brazil. To Pernambuco. After verifying coordinates there, the ship turned home, sailing northeast until arriving at the Azores, a set of islands in the Atlantic, and then from there on to England, arriving at Falmouth on the 2nd of October 1836, where Darwin left the ship. In 1839, Darwin married his cousin Emma Wedgwood, and then moved to Down House the following year, where he stayed essentially the rest of his life, having never traveled any more around the world. He did lots of research, published several books, the first being the book about the voyage of the Beagle. His most famous book, The Origin of Species, was published in 1859, November of 1859, 23 years after returning from his voyage around the world. The ideas that began to germinate during the voyage, he examined in depth for 23 years, finally deciding to publish only after he received news that a fellow biologist, Alfred Russel Wallace, had independently come up with the same ideas of natural selection. So that's a quick overview of the voyage of the Beagle. One of the most impactful voyages of science ever undertaken.